Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on executive function. Today's topic is cultivating cognitive flexibility. This is within the realm of strengthening executive function in the early years. How do we design environmental scaffolds and child-specific interventions? Again, welcome to this webinar. And I want to begin with thanking AbleNet University for making this webinar possible for all of us. So the last two webinar sessions, the first one focused on how do we strengthen working memory, one of the components of executive function. And the second one focused on inhibitory control, impulse control. And today, the webinar will focus on flexibility in thinking, cognitive flexibility, especially how do we cultivate that in young children. As a matter of fact, all of us need cognitive flexibility so that we can look at things from different perspectives. We are open to recommendations and suggestions, and we have an open mind, and which broadens our thinking. And how do we nurture that in young children? So that's today's focus. And how do we create a growth-promoting environment? You do not have to abandon your usual routine or your usual structured activities, but within that routine, how can we have activities that are growth promoting, that are joyful? How do we embed games and music and movement and drama and role play to make learning novel, make learning joyful, and also for the children to engage much more with that learning and that instruction? And then there are some children who are going to need some additional learner-specific, student-specific scaffolds to support them to play an active role during instruction and to benefit from learning. How do we provide that? So we will look at that. And we will also look at, which I have mentioned in many of my webinars and in the last two, and the universal design for learning. How do we make sure children access that learning, all children? How do we reduce the complexity level for some children? How do we increase the participation? How do we increase the action and expression of the children so that they benefit from that instruction? Ultimately, to lead to the attainment of social, emotional, cognitive, language competence in children and prepare them for school success. So, as I said, our focus today is on cognitive flexibility. I will just briefly touch on the basics. We have already covered it in the last two webinars, so if you get a chance, you can go back and visit those webinars. They are recorded, but just to bring everybody together on this webinar, I will touch a little bit on what executive function is, what are the components, why is it important to intervene in the early years. In my book on executive function, which is where a lot of the material for today's presentation comes from, I have all the three components as well as many other ideas. And one of the important things that I have added is, as I mentioned earlier, how do we incorporate games and songs and movement and role play and storytelling, visuals, all of those tools and techniques that can be very easily incorporated in pre-K, kindergarten, first grade setting, or as a matter of fact, in any learning setting, especially at the elementary level. So this is my book, and it's published by LRP Publication. And this particular slide shows my other books. I do work in the areas of autism, significant disabilities, and the paraeducator training and early childhood education. So What is executive function? Just a brief overview. It's the foundational building blocks. It's the how of learning. When you're teaching math, when you're teaching reading, or when you're engaging in learning language activities, these are the skills, the what of learning, the content of learning. The EFs provide the foundation, the how. How do we learn? The process of learning. And as I said, EF is categorized into three major cognitive processes. Working memory, that means we connect with information that we have already learned and bring it to use when we need it. So it's kind of memory, but it's also connected with past knowledge. It's also the ability to attend. It's the ability to sustain that attention. It's that ability to bring that information when we need it. Then self-control. Self-control, I cannot emphasize how important it is, and all of you know it, especially if you have been an educator working with young children. You know how critical self-control is, self-regulation is, not only to be able to attend and benefit from learning, but for social interactions, to get along with peers, to get along with adults. And today's topic, which is cognitive flexibility, it is the ability to shift gears. And how do we adjust to changing demands? Though they do operate to some extent independently, the three components are also interdependent to some extent. So, what is cognitive flexibility? I'm going to go into greater detail in another slide, but just for the beginning understanding of it, to be able to apply different rules in different settings. So in other words, when I'm in the playground, I can shout, I can talk loudly, but when I'm in the hallway, I am quiet. Or when I'm in the assembly hall, I am quiet. So, and when I'm in the classroom, it's kind of slightly different. I can talk, but I can't shout. I can't scream. So, and the other thing is the ability to shift gears and adapt to different environment, which kind of is connected with the previous one that I mentioned, but this is also takes it to be able to adjust to different settings and different activities, and to be able to shift gears and move from one activity to another. And then also to be able to adjust to work with different people. And why do we have to focus on EF in the early years? There are several reasons. First of all, children are not born with EFs. It is something that is shaped by experience, and the nurturing environment, an environment that focuses on cultivating EFs, the children will benefit the most. And the second reason is some of the children maybe have some executive function differences or deficit, especially children with autism may have impaired cognitive flexibility and also maybe self-regulation difficulties. They do know, I think most of you may be familiar with this, that they have difficulty adjusting to changes in strategies, changes in routines, changes or transitioning between tasks. All of this may present problem to them, and so they do have a cognitive flexibility issue. And research also tells us that children who grow up in poverty may have some EF difficulties, and EFs are very critical for academic success. And it is also critical for success beyond school and for life itself. One of the beautiful things about the intervention in the earlier years, those children who have deficits in EFs, they benefit the most from the intervention. And also another reason is the brain's plasticity in the early years is most pronounced. The neural connections in the brain, they grow very rapidly at a rate of 1 million synapses per second. I mentioned this in my last webinars. And also, as a matter of fact, there is some evidence showing that second language learning is earlier, which requires cognitive flexibility to be switching between two languages. And the third thing that I want to mention, that's the benefit of EFs in the early years, it reduces, the research says, the impact of poverty. So with that background, let's go ahead and begin thinking about how do we cultivate cognitive flexibility. I would like to begin with where you are on this, in the spectrum. What environmental and instructional support do you already provide that may be helping children with cognitive flexibility as well as the general EF? So do you make sure that you have minimal amount of visual and auditory distractions? This is helpful for cognitive flexibility as well as for self-regulation, inhibitory control. Do you offer visual supports, visual boundaries, rules posted with pictures, visual object schedule consistently to help children? Do you prepare children for transition, especially those transitions that are not part of the routine, some transitions that are part of the routine? A transition that's not part of the routine is a fire drill or an assembly. And then there may be some those are non-routine, but there may be some that happen every day, and there may be a problem every day when a child has difficulty coming back in from recess. Do you use pretend play opportunities? Do you regularly, consistently use brainstorming techniques to help build children's flexible thinking? Do you also combine it with communication and assistive technology tools? So you have a slide here with those choices, and do go ahead and respond to the question. I would appreciate knowing so that you can build on what you are already doing through this webinar. It's good. Looks like many of you are using visual supports and preparing ahead of time for transitions. Those are critical things. I'm very delighted to see that few visual and auditory distraction, because the last time during my webinar I mentioned about the research on that. Okay, oof, wonderful, wonderful, all of the things. Okay, I think we will find pretend play and brainstorming techniques is heavily emphasized in this. So the winner is, of course, visual supports, and many of you are very familiar with the visual support. That's wonderful. Okay, now what are some cognitive flexibility difficulties that young children experience? We will go through several examples. So the first one is adjusting changes in routine activities and environments, and kind of making transitions can trigger tantrum. So for example, it may even begin with getting off the bus in the morning. Or if there is no recess that day and you go right almost to the exit door and then you find it's raining and you come back in, that may cause a major tantrum. You may find that when there is a sudden assembly and you have not prepared ahead of time, that may present a challenge. However, many of you say you do. And certainly what I have observed is when there is a tornado drill in one of the classrooms, the children got so terrified because they were not prepared and they had to get under the table and they were just not able, they had not practiced that. It may seem strange that we are saying we have to practice, but this is something we need to practice, especially if you have children with autism that you are serving. And shifting focus from one activity to another may be difficult for some children. If they are playing with Lego and we ask them it's time to clean up, then that may cause a tantrum for a child. And also sometimes when they are very fond of working on computers and you ask them to say the time is up, now we are going to have circle time, that may cause, or we are going to line up to go to recess. Adjusting to appreciating different perspectives. That a lot of children have difficulty kind of thinking flexibility. For example, a child may be struggling again and again to put a certain block on top of something or build a structure. And when you or some other child goes in to help that child, the child may just knock the whole structure off, fall down on the floor, and may have a tantrum because they have not learned how to accept suggestion. And so this is something that may require some training. And adjusting to different sets of rules. Once you go into the assembly hall, you have to be quiet, but you can be loud in the playground. That may be difficult for children, and also especially for children with autism. And I have noticed this in children who are blind or visually impaired, to initiate communication. How do we sustain a conversation? How do we move the whole team with that conversation so that that's where the teacher may come in or the therapist may come in and help the children to be able to focus on the group conversation and not just perseverate on what the child is thinking. So these are all things that are part of cognitive flexibility challenges, and what are some things we can do to cultivate cognitive flexibility. As I mentioned right at the very beginning, we want to make sure that we apply the principles, the learning principles of universal design for learning in order to make sure we allow for every child to actively participate. We allow for every child to be able to respond to questions, and maybe using technology, maybe using pictures, maybe making choices. And we also want to make sure we make the activity so motivating that every child is engaged. So we need different methods of presentation. The other thing that is very important to recognize when you're working with young children, they are at different stages of growth and development. And it is important to reduce the complexity level for some children so that they feel confident and competent to respond, to participate, to get involved. And so we have to reduce that when we are asking questions in order to build that confidence so that the child says, okay, I'm going to attempt responding to that question. We have to make sure we ask the question in a specific way, lowering the complexity level. And the other thing I want to mention in terms of best practices, when you get a chance, do visit the Division for Early Childhood Best Practice Division for Early Childhood website and get information on the recommended practices. So we looked at some of the issues in terms of cognitive flexibility. Now let's see what are some things that will help cultivate. What are the cognitive flexibility builders? Certainly we need, and it looks like many of you already provide some of these things, the personalized supports so that our transitions are smooth. And visual supports, many of you said that you use. How do we organize the physical setting? Many of you already mentioned about auditory and visual distractors being very limited. And do you use timers? Do you use like a behavior cue cards to help with transition? Those are some of the things. And then do we teach social skills so that they will initiate and sustain their conversation with their peers? And do we use brainstorming ideas so that we take, let's take one example. It's raining outside. You already know that it's raining outside and they don't have recess. So what are some other things? Have the children do a quick brainstorming. What are some other things we can do in the classroom or within the school so that we still have fun like playing, but some other kind of play that we can do, or some other kind of recess. Can you invite children to respond, brainstorm? And I will share other things that you can use during your circle time and with stories and all that. And then one of the things that we don't use that much is imaginary play. How do we engage children? And we do have an ideal environment, especially in pre-K and K, and maybe even in first grade. How can we use pretend play to view from different perspectives? I take on the role of a mother bird, or I take on the role of a baby bird. And then the other technique that's helpful is group storytelling. I will go into further explanation each of these builders in a future slide that will be coming up. How do we tell stories as a group? How each child participates to his level of skill in that, so that we are patient, taking turns, and we listen and we talk. So to an evolving story, they contribute. And then one of the things that I'm going to share with you is how to use simple songs, transition songs. And I will share one example. And some of these things take a minute or less. And that is specific to an activity so that the transition is joyful, the transition is smooth. And then how do you incorporate games and movement activities so that we can apply different rules in different settings? Okay, some of the easiest to achieve are environmental supports. How do we make sure we have a consistent, predictable routine, and make sure we have preparation for any changes in the routine or personnel, including, like, for example, if you're going to have an assembly, if you're going to have a fire drill, we practice for that so that they are prepared when there is a real fire drill or any kind of emergency. How do we maximize the learning time? How do we use transition activities like songs or physical movement? How do we set up, make sure that we have a calming space in the classroom so that the student can go there when the student is feeling agitated, and making sure there is a designated seating available with the child's name and photo within the classroom. That helps the child to kind of identify as his or her location. And then also we have to make sure we provide task-specific feedback. Oh, I like the way you walk down the playground. Oh, good, you are lining up. That's wonderful. Let's walk nicely back to the classroom. And then how do we gradually eliminate or fade, in the beginning fade, and then eliminate the intensive prompts that may be needed at the beginning stages of learning. Okay, visual supports. Make sure that you have an activity schedule that you use consistently, where the child is gradually moving the activity to the completed section. I'm sure many of you are using that. And make sure when you use an activity schedule, I didn't have photographs there, but make sure there is a photo along paired with the text to kind of bring immediate. It may not be helpful for a child who is blind, but for a child who is blind, you can attach an object that may be helpful. And also, these are kind of like the behavior cue cards, and you carry this in a keychain, key ring, wherever you go, and you can use it in different settings. And also to help children who have difficulty staying in a designated spot when they are sitting in a circle time, or when they are sitting at a desk and they are working with you, create a kind of a boundary around the desk or boundary around the mat if they are sitting on a mat, so that they stay within that personal space. And in one of my previous webinars, I mentioned about how to train. And also for children who had difficulty making the transition, using a timer, and then first you do this, and then the computer, and many of you would be familiar with that. Okay, let's look at circle time and center time, which are the most frequently used activities in pre-K and K. What can we do to help children? One of the first things that I would like to mention is a brainstorming activity, and I already mentioned about when you don't have recess and it's raining, what can you do? But you can also use it with many of the stories that you share with. You can also use it with if there is a problem. How do we learn to share? Sharing. And then you can combine it with puppets and then get children to respond. If the puppets explaining like a little conflict that comes up between the two characters, and then use a brainstorming tool on the right-hand side. Left-hand side, you may be holding the puppets. On the right-hand side, you invite children to respond, and you fill up that brainstorming chart. And I will have some other examples later on. And what would you do in terms of training again is using sorting and matching activities. First, you sort by color, then you sort by shape, and then is shape and color, and then you sort by size, shape, and color. So in other words, they have to think flexibly in order to achieve that. That may require some training for some, but some children may get it immediately. But it's very important training. It's based on research. And involve children in pretend play. Let them assume different roles. Let them see things from different perspectives, which helps think flexibility. And then different perspective, and to build, to think from different perspective, as well as to facilitate group play. One of the things that you can easily do is kind of strategically set up your centers. Let's say you have a block center. Structure the activity and give them like a little project. They have to build a fence because former McDonald's farm is being attacked by the rabbits, and they're eating all the carrots away. So how can you build a fence and then have several children working together, brainstorming together, talking together? When you're doing an art activity, cover up a table with newsprint or colored paper and have children work on it together. You can do the same thing with a writing activity. Each one either draws a picture and a word, adds a word, and some children may write sentences or phrases, and you can guide them. This promotes writing, this promotes group participation, this promotes each one working together, taking turns using that paper, but at the same time tolerating the others who are next to them. So this is the brainstorming tool that I've been talking about. Let's take the story of It Looked Like Spelt Milk. For those of you who are not familiar with the story, this is a wonderful book, wonderful picture book, and you can use it, as a matter of fact, I feel, even to do some STEM thinking, science, technology, engineering, math, because that's the final page in the book. This is a book written by Charles Shaw, and it's a very interesting book because this is a lot of guesswork, lot of making predictions. Oh, what is this? It looks like spelt milk. Is it a spelt milk? Is it an ice cream cone? Is it a birthday cake? Is it a rabbit? And it goes on and on. And children you don't have to read the page and let the children make a guess. Of course, they will be able to see the picture, especially with the rabbit and the birthday cake and the ice cream cone, and name it. But you can also, before you even begin the story, you can say you draw a shape using the kind of the graphic organizer I have shown on this slide. Make a shape like a few that I have shown, like the moon or a cloud or like a little balloon or something else, and let them guess what is it, and then maybe something that looks a little bit like a flower but not sure, and have them make what it is, make them guess. So this enables flexible thinking, and that there are no right or wrong answers. All answers are welcome. It builds their confidence and their ability to answer questions. And for children who are, I'm going to come to this slide, and for those children who are not using words to communicate, one of the things is they would use an assistive technology device like the iTalk2 communicator, and they have two pictures and they pick one out of that. And for a child who is blind, they may be given some shapes, and then they will say what that shape is. What does it feel like? And they will talk about that. And following that story that I mentioned, it looked like spilled milk, what you can do is have them come up with what are some tools that they can use to make shapes on paper. What can you use? Can you use a feather duster? Can you use a sponge? Can you use a washcloth? Let them come up with different things. And again, if a response sounds kind of confusing, you can ask the child to say it again. But accept all responses, because they can dip any type of item really into paint and make marks, and then follow it up with a hands-on activity immediately for them to use different tools to make shapes on paper. What this does is that learning becomes hands-on, becomes very joyful, and also, another person may have used a sponge, somebody else used a paintbrush, somebody else used a white brush, somebody used a cloth, so they can see that there is no one correct answer. So sometimes we have to let that experiment go on in order to build that cognitive flexibility. Another beautiful story, some of you may be familiar with that, it's called Caps for Sale. And this is a story where the monkeys have taken all the caps from the peddler, from his head, when he was trying to rest under the tree. Now, the peddler gets all angry when he wakes up because he cannot find his caps. And then he looks up and he sees that the monkeys have the caps. And so he is very angry and annoyed, and he's getting very upset. But at least initially, it is not yielding any results for him. So stop at that point when you read the story. Ask the children, how can the peddler get get the caps back? And get them to respond. Can the peddler give the monkey some money? Can the peddler give, you may want to, if there is no response, you may want to kind of suggest one or two ideas. Can the peddler give monkey some food? That a child may come up with that. So get them to come up with some possible solutions, and then read the story about what really happened in that story. This way, you're also giving a little break in between for the children to talk, so that sustains their attention and also keeps them on the mat or wherever you are sitting, and it improves their working memory as well. So, and flexible thinking. So another activity that you can pursue to build cognitive flexibility, it's called group storytelling. And how do you pursue group storytelling? What you do, most of you, I think, would be familiar with the story of Are You My Mother by P.D. Eastman. And this is a story that's about a mother bird going out to look for some food for her baby bird. And in the meanwhile, the baby bird jumps down from the nest, goes around asking everyone that he comes across, are you my mother? Are you my mother? And many of them say they are not, until finally he finds his mother. So you can do that with the whole group. So you can start off saying, once upon a time, like traditional stories start, A mummy bird and a baby bird lived in a nest. And the mother bird went looking for food to feed her baby, and the baby bird went looking. And I am assuming you have already read this story so that the children are kind of familiar with the pattern, and then it's easier for you to do this group storytelling. And then the teacher passes on the story after she has done the kind of the introduction to one of the children who you think is usually pretty confident in coming up with some kind of a response, and then you give it to all the children to have a turn, and some children who have communication difficulties may make either choices or may look at a picture and respond or hold an object and show the object to the other, but every child has an opportunity to respond. That's one thing. The second thing in this particular one that I want to add that Galinsky has mentioned, which is very, very interesting, that is the child, in order to promote children from taking turns, she suggests that you give them mouthpiece and an earpiece. In other words, earpiece is a picture that you show everybody that when somebody is talking, you listen. And then the child whose turn it is to talk has the mouth picture. So that's a simple way where they are not all talking at the same time, but it's also, and gradually maybe you may be able to remove that when they have learned that they should be quiet when the other children are, when the other child is talking or sharing the story. And some children may add a word, some children a phrase, a sentence. Encourage all responses. Even if the story is going in a completely different direction from what you thought or from the original story, that's fine. They have to practice flexible thinking, and they have to take turns, and they accept other person's presentation of the story, a word or a phrase or whatever they do. So, and based on research, which is the Center for the Developing Child at Harvard, which I have mentioned, is one of the fantastic resources available, and it is listed in the resources section, the website. They recommend this group storytelling, and I have found personally, from my own experience, it helps a lot with the children's flexible thinking and being patient when another child is talking. Okay, now let's look at some scenarios. A child, a pre-kindergartner, Nina, she has a lot of difficulty in seeing things from the perspective of other children, and then kind of come up with some alternative solutions when she encounters a conflict. For example, insisting on wanting to play with her favorite toy, which is Lego, during center time, she will not allow other children to come near the Lego. When they come, she will scream. Somehow she feels it's her toy, and she has difficulty kind of giving up her turn with the Lego, and it causes a kind of a commotion in the classroom. So what can we do? And something very similar happens when she goes out for recess, and her favorite in the playground equipment is a swing, and she will wait and not play with anything else so that she can swing. So how do we teach her flexible thinking? One of the things, of course, in order to prevent that commotion and her ability to give up Lego one day or a couple of days or one day a week, we want to make sure we teach her using a social story format. It's called social narratives, and you can find it in the autism internet modules, samples of social narratives and explanations of how to create it. I have kind of given you a couple of sample pages in a later slide. So you do want to teach her how she needs to understand the thoughts and feelings of others. That's why it is important to think from different perspectives, and that's why we use brainstorming tools. Also, help her when she is calm, not when she is having a tantrum. What are some other play options? What alternatives are there that will give her the same? Maybe there is some other bricks in the classroom that you can use. Maybe you have some cars. She can line the cars up, or you can put them in she can put them in a certain order from big to small, or something like that, that will give her kind of that touch with that object that she may be getting from the Lego. Also, teach her the turtle technique. I mentioned it in my last session. The turtle technique, if you can certainly Google it. It is from the Social Emotional Foundations of Learning, Center for the Social Emotional Foundations of Learning. Turtle technique is, I pretend like a turtle. The children pretend like a turtle. They have a problem, so they pull their heads in. They count to 10, and during that time, they calm down. And then they recognize that they have a problem and they need to find a different thing. In case of Nina, she has to learn to calm down and say, I have to find another toy to play with. And then initially, she may have to use some pictures to guide her in terms of the other toys in the classroom that she can use. But if her tantrum continues, guide her gradually to the calming space, which I mentioned before. And when she moves there, oh, I like the way you move to that place. Or if she calms down and she finds another toy to play with, make sure, compliment her and provide specific feedback. Oh, you found the cars to play with. That's great, Nina. And avoid any kind of a reactive response. That's it. You've lost it. Now you go to timeout. None of those have a long-term benefit. Okay, this is a kind of a mini sample pages from a social story kind of type of thing, social narrative type of thing, to teach social play. How do we get to happy play? I like to play with Lego. Other children also like to play with Lego. I have to find another toy. And I can be happy playing with cars. You can mention all that in another page. Then my friend gets to play with Lego. My friend is happy. I play with cars. I am happy. I get to play with Lego another day. And then everyone is happy kind of thing. And another student scenario, this is a kindergarten child who is 6 years old. He has difficulty shifting focus from one activity to another and make a smooth transition. He usually throws a tantrum, whining and crying, and it may be computer to something else, or when he is on the outside and he has to come back in, he has difficulty making that transition. So one of the things that he needs almost daily practice, and it is possible within the routine, you can adjust that. Prior to transition, he gets an advance cue. So in other words, in the beginning, he will need a reminder. For example, he is outside. You are playing outside, and you have to line up. So maybe 2 minutes before you line up, he gets an advance cue that it is time. And you can also combine it with a musical instrument. When the musical instrument is played, like a stir xylophone, you can kind of pair it with a picture card. That means in 2 minutes, we are going to be lining up, and then we will be going back to the classroom. And maybe he can bring something with him. Maybe he can bring the musical toy. He can bring a puppet back to the classroom. That's what he holds, and that's his job as he is making the transition. And also try to move him. That's why you are preparing him. And let's say he is working on the computer and he has to move again 2 minutes before or 5 minutes before, giving him an advance signal, and then preparing him, and then 1 minute before he moves to the next activity, assuming it's the circle time, he moves to that, he goes, gets his mat, and he sits down. But avoid trying to get him when he is exhibiting the tantrum behaviors. Let him learn to calm down, teach him the calming techniques, and maybe he can always be tempted with his favorite toy that he gets to hold and bring it to the center, and then he puts it down in a little basket when your lesson begins. And also praise others who are lining up, praise others who are coming to the mat if he has. And then when he stops the tantrum and joins the activity, provide him immediate feedback. Okay, now we are moving on to what kind of games we can play. There are a number of games that you can play. The opposite game, it's called the go, no, go game. And games are very joyful. Games are has become almost a novelty in our classrooms, at least based on my observation. But games are highly motivating. It kind of increases their interest level, the focus level of the children. The go-no game, the teacher says one thing and the children do the opposite. Let's say the teacher says, jump up and down. The children stay still. Let's say the teacher brings her hands together and keeps it silently together, the palms together, and the children start clapping. So in other words, it's kind of a fun, but they do the opposite or totally different from that. That brings, because they are listening, but they are doing something different, so it kind of brings flexible thinking. And we all know Simon Says. Simon Says is a great game for building that flexible thinking. You do it only when Simon Says, and so make sure many times that you omit Simon Says. That helps them to not only be flexible in their thinking, but also to pay attention, and so which helps with both self-regulation and working memory. And then use activity-specific songs, music, using music to make transition. And I am going to share with you a slide, and hopefully if it works, also a 1-minute song to build that transition to be very smooth. What you do is you use keywords specific to the transition so that it's kind of the transition is smooth. And it helps the children to move calmly to that. A music therapist and I put together a music CD, and I'll share. And involve children in kind of musical movement. In other words, play songs that involve movement as a break. That will build their attention for the next activity. So do it for about 5 minutes. Don't put the whole CD, just 1 or 2 songs that take a couple of minutes each. And then bring them to the group circle time where you are teaching math, or you are teaching something science, or teaching language lesson. And another one is tapping the rhythm sticks together. Again, do it in a way that builds flexibility, changing the number of times they tap, or changing it from soft tap to loud tap. So that kind of helps them to adjust to different settings, different number of taps and all that, flexible thinking. And then do the freeze dance. So when they freeze, show them a picture so that they have to kind of do the action that's in the picture. That means it's a more extensive than just the freeze song, which helps again build their flexible thinking, but it also builds the brain, by the way. This is the musical transition that I mentioned. It's a preventive measure. A music therapist by the name of Clara Law and I put together, and it's you can get the CD from National Professional Resources. It is designed with the principles of music therapy, and these are very simple songs. I would call it songlets because it's either a minute or less, and some are maybe even only 40 seconds or something. They take the kind of melody from a popular song nursery rhyme, and then put words that are appropriate, specific to a transition. So let's say we are going to be listening to the Time for Circle, and this particular song invites children to come to the circle, and let's say you have had centers, then they, now it's time for circle, circle. I don't want to sing because you don't want to hear me sing. And you can combine it with chimes and tambourines or other musical instruments, and then it kind of gives the directions musically. Sit in the circle, sit in the circle, the circle. And the words are there. I'm going to move on.
Use this songlet to transition children to the circle time area. Circle time is any small group gathering for stories, songs, movement to music, or other instructional activities. Now it's time for circle, for circle, for circle. Now it's time for circle, so come and sit down. Sit in the circle, the circle, the circle. Sit in the circle, come and sit down. Eyes are looking, feet are quiet, hands on lap, ears are listening. Now it's time for circle, so come and sit down.
What you do when you sing, you are not using every song, for example, on the CD, and you don't use song every transition. You identify those transitions that are challenging and use only those particular songs. And it is not necessary to be a singer. I mean, you can just sing, and children will accept even my singing, let's say. And through the song, you are actually cueing the child to the required behavior. And this particular CD has different types of songs, choose your center or snack time, lunch time, and you can pick a song that you want. You can kind of memorize it and use it. You can listen to it a few times. Okay. Now, additional games and activities so that they learn how to team with peers, so that they develop kind of tolerance to wait and take turns. And most importantly, this is a great age and a developmental time when you want to teach children to play cooperatively with peers. And we are building for the future. We are building for life success. So one of the games you can use is parachute game, and so that they're working cooperatively together, and they follow the actions of each other, and they're tossing the ball or some object that you put in there in the middle of the parachute as they are tossing it up and down. And one of the other things that you can use is follow the leader and kind of make sure that you rotate the leader so that all children have the opportunity. And certainly those children who have difficulty following rules should get a chance to be the leader so that they can experience that. And then do group art and group painting in kind of move your easels, one-to-one easel away from the classroom and use large tables for your painting and art activity. And at the same time, also try and see if you can use a writing activity that's paired with children's drawing. And then you can use that as display in your classroom. You can talk about, it looked like spelt milk that we had before, and then they make these shapes, and then they write something about what that shape is. They label it, they write a sentence, they write a phrase, or they write a word, or they just draw a picture, or they just stamp. And then that is their artwork, that is their literacy work, and they are also taking turns. What did I do? Okay, and there are some book suggestions on this page. Fish is Fish, Corduroy, Caps for Sale, and of course my favorite is It Looked Like Spelt Milk. and then you have the music CD that I shared with you. Sometimes children have very big challenges when it comes to fire drill or school gathering. It is extremely important that each time that we have that, it doesn't become a kind of a major meltdown. So be sure to prepare the children in advance. Be sure to see if you can use some kind of a video to kind of prepare the child of what to expect when there is a drill, and what do they have to do, especially when they have to get under the table or when they have to go outside and they have to hear that loud siren. And one of the other things you can do also is, as part of your learning experience, is to bring firemen into the classroom and let them, make a presentation to your children. So that adds to their knowledge level. And but if you should have a consistent issue with these kind of fire drills or tornado drills or other kind of drills, make sure you have some additional support. And also on a regular basis, almost every day, I would suggest try to use calming techniques. And there are a variety of assistive technology devices that are displayed on this page, and there is a lot more. I am just showing a few, like a quick talker, maybe for a child who can use the device fairly comfortably because it has multiple icons to communicate. And for a child who is trying to make a choice among the answers, let's say, is this ice cream, is this a rabbit? And, given three choices, the child presses that, color the talking brick and makes a choice, and the child responds. Or you may have an I talk to communicator where the child is making a kind of a yes or no response. Or you may use a step-by-step in order to be able to, with already pre-recorded messages that has a sequential type of thing, so the child can respond in a kind of a sequence. And of course, there are certain apps also available that you can use these days. That's going to be one of the things that I like to mention is a software. It's called the Inspiration software. It's a very helpful visual mapping tool. And another one is Tools for Students. These are very helpful tools in terms of using technology. If you're using a lot of technology, these are softwares and apps that are available for brainstorming. And finally, as we close, I want to share with you some basic tips for the general, as a conclusion to this EF Executive Functioning webinar series. It builds the brain. And early childhood years are the most important for building the brain and that flexibility in thinking, for that inhibitory control and working memory, the skills, the foundational skills that you need for learning. Make sure that your activity is heightening the children's interest, engaging, sustaining their attention, because brain loves action. Incorporate storytelling, role play, drama, and movement. Use a kind of an interactive learning process to sustain attention. I explained that with this spilt milk. You begin the story, and then you have a brainstorming activity, and then you go back to the story, because that sustains their interest. And also it helps them to sustain their interest for a longer period of time, so that they can sit down and listen and learn. And incorporate routinely novel materials. Have at the beginning of the lesson, like a magic box. And what's going to come out of the magic box today? Is it going to be a puppet? Is it going to be a musical instrument? And or is it going to be a magnet? That will interest their curiosity, and it will sustain motivation. Play games. It exercises working memory. It builds attention, flexibility in thinking, and they have to take turns. They cannot push each other, so self-regulation. And routinely weave multi-sensory features into your lesson, for them to touch something, for them to smell something, for them to feel something, so that they are moving and touching and experiencing, and strengthen the children's emotional literacy. Read books that will build their emotional vocabulary, role-play problem-solving situation. And then how do you respond with calming techniques? Teach. Every day, incorporate a little bit of yoga, a little bit of mindfulness exercise, just for a couple of minutes, so that they develop self-regulation. Hope you have enjoyed this series of 3 webinars, and you're going to be able to use some or more, maybe a lot of the ideas from these webinar series to assist with not only building cognitive flexibility, but self-regulation, impulse control, and working memory to prepare children for school success, school readiness, and life success. I have included in the next slides several resources, including where you can get the musical transition CD. And as we close, I want to mention that I'm extremely thankful to AbleNet University for hosting this series of webinars. And my next 2 webinars, October 11th and November 1st, will focus on a completely different topic, more for children with significant needs, maybe some severe and multiple do, for children in grade levels on how do you develop standards-based IEPs that is linked to the academic curriculum. And then on November 29th, I will present a session, webinar session on mindfulness, yoga, and breathing practices to help children develop calming and attentional control. Thank you very much to AbleNet, and thank you all for attending. If you have any questions, do put them in the chat box, and I'll be happy to answer them. Again, thank you. Have a great